I wanted to talk about the presidential race and all of the stuff that's going on with Joe Biden, whether he should step down, the fears and concerns that a lot of people had about his performance, and also a lot of the pushback that we're getting about why Biden shouldn't or can't step down as a candidate for president. I'm of the opinion, which I'll explain, that Joe Biden does need to step down. But it's not just like a political horse race thing. There are real important things at stake right now. But I wanted to start by just providing a frame. I think anytime that you make a big argument like this, especially if it's maybe going to be seen by people who don't know you, then it's helpful to provide kind of some boundaries for what you're talking about. So just to be clear, even if Joe Biden doesn't drop out, which I think will be a mistake, he's still a much better candidate than Donald Trump. Donald Trump he's unethical, he's immoral, he does not understand how our Constitution works, his intentions are bad, he's a malignant person. Every aspect of who he is and how he intends to govern is bad. That being said, it's also important to remember that that floor that he sets is not the floor that Democrats should seek to clear. Whoever wants to be president or whoever wants to stake a claim to political leadership in this country should do much better, much better, and should aspire to do much better than Donald Trump, should hold themselves to a higher standard than Donald Trump in every respect. All right, so that's where I start with that. Now, that being said, I think it's important to really focus on three things. One, a lot of the discussion goes straight to kind of the meta-analysis of like, can Biden win? Or all the political horse race things. Or they will talk about what happens next and the complexities of it. I think, though, that if you don't actually sit with and think about and talk about what we saw and what it means for Joe Biden as a person to occupy the office of the presidency, I think you're making a big mistake. Set aside all the what will happen. You have to start with the idea that it was a genuinely catastrophic performance. I get really irritated when people compare this to the Obama-Romney debate in 2012. I went back and watched the whole thing. It is a substantively different concern, event, performance than what we saw last week from Joe Biden. In some ways, President Obama showed kind of the worst of himself in that debate, and that he was maybe a little too dismissive, sometimes condescending, did not seem fully invested in the moment. But it's also the case that he was entirely coherent, made complex arguments, spoke fluidly. It was clear he understood where he was and at all times understood the things that were being talked about. That is not an apt comparison to what we saw. From Joe Biden, we saw moments where he lost his train of thought. It's not a proper medical diagnosis, but he seemed to have glitches where what was going on seemed to drop from his mind, and he sort of scrambled and he couldn't make up. He's old, right? And for the last several years, people, especially within the Democratic establishment, have pushed back on the idea that his age wasn't an impediment to him doing a good job. I think that his presidency has been highly successful. And if he had decided a year ago that he wasn't going to run again, his 4 years, there would have been a narrative built up that it was massively successful, both in terms of what he sought to do, which was to stop Donald Trump and prevent Trumpism from metastasizing, but also successful on a whole host of bipartisan bills and pulling the country out of what was really just a devastating moment economically and socially. Everything in America isn't exactly as we want it to be right now. But one of the things that's been really clear in this election is that people have not really remembered 2019 and 2020 and just how badly that went and just how much of that disaster you can lay. Not all of it, because COVID was not caused by Donald Trump, but it was exacerbated by a slew of mistakes that he made. So he could have gone down as a great president had he made that choice, but he chose not to. And so it's a real issue now going forward when you have someone who is obviously compromised, who is not all there mentally. I think it's probably the case that most of the time he has the wherewithal to do the job on a day-to-day basis. But the two things with that are that one, most of the time isn't good enough. You have to be able to be president all the time. This is why, for example, if a president undergoes surgery where they have to anesthetize them, they will go through the formal process of having the vice president temporarily assume the office of the presidency and all that that entails. All right, and second is that, you know, there's this line, I think it was in The Sun Also Rises, the Hemingway book, where this is, how did you go bankrupt? You know, very slowly and all at once, or something like that. And that's how kind of someone's mental acuity goes. If you've had relatives who've gotten older, that's kind of the case. It's like they're kind of there, they're mostly there, and then one day it drops off really precipitously. And so much of the press reports are about, you know, who Joe was a year ago is different than he is now. And we're talking about him being president almost 5 years from now still. And he doesn't have the capacity, or it wouldn't seem that he would have the capacity to do those things, because what the debate was, it wasn't a performance issue. It wasn't a matter of, you know, he had a bad night. We saw real cognitive lapses, and there are genuine reasons that well-meaning people have to believe that Biden cannot do this job, and certainly not for 4 more years. And a lot of the just one bad night thing that people push back with, or try to frame it as, you know, you're being disloyal. There's a superseding loyalty to the country, and to the fact that the president has a host of responsibilities that are hugely important. It sounds melodramatic to bring this up now, but, you know, the president has the sole authority to launch any or all of America's 5,500 nuclear missiles. The president, you know, on a more everyday level, he really is the person who's supposed to be in charge of all of the different advisors and bureaus and, you know, branches of the government. And so, yeah, it's true that it's probably the case that his inner circle and his cabinet have taken up a lot of duties and have effectively run the country. They've managed it well. But what happens when there's not a central person who's driving the car is that you get misallocation of kind of attention. So I think you could probably look back and say Biden's lapses on the border, how much of that was the fact that too much control was spun out to advisors, whereas if he had been on the ball much earlier, he would have said, this is something we need to prioritize. And linked to that is the question, you know, that flows out of our belief in our democracy, which is that we don't actually vote for his advisors. So while we should hopefully trust that someone puts good people in place, there aren't the systems of vetting and accountability for advisors in the same way that there is for a president. We go through the process of selecting a president so that we can maintain kind of contact with whether or not that person is capable of doing the job. And part of that means, are they watching all of the people who are under them? So you might have faith that Anthony Blinken can be an effective Secretary of State, but that faith is really a faith that we invest in Biden to make sure that that happens. And so if that person who is supposed to be the pilot of the ship, if they are not there, then you have a real kind of potential for political disaster. There's several moments in American history where we've had presidents who've been either, you know, compromised or incapacitated. The most kind of famous of them was Woodrow Wilson, and he had a stroke, and functionally his wife sort of ran the country. The doctors would come to him, and or rather all the advisors would have to go to her, and she wouldn't really allow full access to her husband. I don't think, obviously, that it's as serious as what Woodrow Wilson went through, but that situation is instructive because what happened with Wilson is that there was an important vote that was going to take place in the Senate for whether or not the United States was going to enter the League of Nations. And that was about a month and a half, if I remember, after Wilson had his stroke. Now, it was a real fight about whether or not the United States would enter the League of Nations. It's a whole other story, but the important boiled down point is that he wasn't there to quarterback that fight, and that he couldn't really reach out to Congress to try to do a deal, to pressure people within his own party, to bring people in the Republican Party along, and the vote ends up failing. And his party in the next election, the Democratic Party, suffers a massive defeat. And these things are connected to his inability, to his absence from the public space. And, if you want to play that out, the fact that the United States didn't join the League of Nations ends up having real disastrous consequences in terms of setting the table for World War II. All right. I want to be careful with, over asserting my claim here. But the basic idea, I think, is true, which is that if the president is not there on a day-to-day basis, then he's the one who's supposed to be making the argument for why he's doing a good job, for the vision that he sets for the country. His words have far more import and impact than anything that any of his advisors could say. And one of the things when you look at the polling is, even though most aspects of the American economy are doing really well, and even though the economy that Joe Biden inherited at the start of 2021 was a complete dumpster fire, because Joe Biden has largely been absent from the space where people talk about these things, there are a lot of Americans who believe that I think most Americans believe that Donald Trump would be better for the economy than Joe Biden, according to the polls. And I think that that's just one of myriad instances where people are coming to incorrect conclusions because of an absence of information, because of an absence of an advocate in the president who simply has not been there. And if you look at the debate, it's clear that, well, I won't say it's clear, it's reasonable to suspect that a big part of that absence is because his advisors, and to some extent perhaps himself, don't believe that he could consistently go out there and make the case. Whenever there are important moments in a president's term in office, like an important bill or something like that, or election season comes, they always go out there and barnstorm, right? You see them, the old whistle stop tours, where they're doing every interview they can, they're doing everything they can to get out there. Joe Biden has been absent for a long time, and it's fair to assume that part of that is because he's not capable of consistently and energetically doing that part of the job as president. And so why are all the arguments against Joe Biden stepping down wrong? I think the first is kind of the overarching thing is I think that there's a failure to grasp the core ethical claim, which is set Donald Trump aside, set aside all the concerns about this particular election. A good place to start is often, is this the right thing to do? And the extension of that question is, can this person do the job? For the last 8 years, a consistent theme from Democrats, myself included, has been that the Republican Party have acted with cowardice, that nobody wanted to confront Donald Trump and Trumpism because they feared that doing so would harm their standing in the party. Over and over and over again, Republicans who could have and should have stood up didn't. And you have these constant thing where you see people in the media will talk about, in private, Republicans will tell you X, Y, and Z. That sounds a lot, if just being bluntly honest, like what we're hearing and seeing from Democrats. A lot of in private Democrats aren't comfortable with this. In private Democrats will tell you Joe Biden should step down. In private is nonsense. That's a kind of moral hedging, this phony, right? If you've spent 8 years accusing the other side of doing something, don't also do that thing, right? Do the right thing here by stepping up and saying that this can't and shouldn't go forward. That Biden is not in a place to be an effective president, and almost irrespective of whether we win or lose, I think we could still win. But irrespective of whether he wins or loses, there's still the underlying problem of you have lied to the people and put forward a person who simply cannot do the job of president. And that's a genuine problem. So let's just talk about beyond that, some of the specific claims. The first is that there isn't enough time, right? That it is early August is when there's a call of all the delegates, and they will vote at that point for who they want the nominee to be. 5 weeks from, so that's 5 weeks from the day after tomorrow, I think, is when that happens. 5 weeks is the amount of time, incidentally, between when Prime Minister Sunak in the UK called for elections and when they will be held, which is tomorrow the 4th. 5 weeks is also the amount of time from when Macron called for elections, held the first round, and completed a second round of elections. 5 weeks is enough time to select a candidate. It is enough time for people to come forward, express their interest, for there to be some type of vetting process. I don't think it'll be obviously every Democrat in the country voting, but you could do it with delegates all having a say or something like that. Or at the very least, you could have 5 weeks where you have debates that lead up to convention, and at the physical convention is where the candidate is actually chosen. When people say, well, that's not the rules right now, it's supposed to happen before the convention. Look, all of these rules are things that the Democratic Party has written. They were not, carried down from Mount Sinai, written by the hand of God. They are rules that you can change. So change those rules to fit what the situation is now and provide for a full and fair contest for people to state their claim for the job and then go forward. Now, it's also the case that, you're going to hear a lot of people, if you bring up any particular candidate, they're going to start to nitpick that candidate. It's like, well, they have this weakness or that weakness. Every candidate ever in the history of every democracy has had flaws. And so dismiss that. I think you can also dismiss a lot of the polls that suggest that any particular candidate that they name still doesn't beat Trump. I think right now it's the case, just to take an example, Gavin Newsom. How many American voters actually know anything about Gavin Newsom, good or bad, right? If you're outside of California. So how many people that you poll in Pennsylvania could articulate a reason why they would vote for or against him? You don't know. Same with Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer, whomever, right? Once you go through the process of actually having a comparison, I think the fact that the Democrats are likely to run someone who is younger, who is more articulate than Joe Biden is right now, all of those things present in opposition to Trump really positively. And if there's one thing, and I know people hate polls, but if there's one thing that we have seen that is true in the polls, is that voters are very skeptical of both men's ages, especially Joe Biden's. They overwhelmingly wish they had another choice, that this rematch between these two people is precisely what they do not want. And so if you give them an option for someone younger, a different set of ideas, turn the page on baby boomer politics for the first time since 1992, that is a path forward towards something that I think voters would find more interesting and compelling. Even someone like Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, who I like a lot, so he only has 2 years experience. That's actually a benefit. Someone who is young, but doesn't have a ton of government experience means that at this point, if we're just talking about electoral politics, you don't have all the stuff that gets attached to people who have long political careers. Obama was advised by some people, and if I remember right, he thought at first he needed to wait another 4 or 8 years because he wasn't ready, but all the smart people told him, in politics, you're much better off being too soon. And so all of these things that are flaws, many of them are features. A rushed process is a contracted election season that can hold voters' interest. And if you end that with a young, compelling candidate, Inexperience in this election is not a weakness. It is a strength. People are tired of what they have, and inexperience is just another way of saying new. And if you go in a different direction, I think that it's the case that there's a strong chance the Democrats can win. That Trump against any of these younger Democrats is a bad matchup for Donald Trump. Like I said, I think that this is obvious to anyone who's being honest with themselves and with you that that Joe Biden is not in early July 2024 up for 4 more years of being president. This is not something to gloat about or be happy about. It mostly makes me sad, because to put myself briefly in his spot, like you're watching a man confronting his mortality. Right? There is no political life after the presidency for an 81-year-old man. And it is hard to leave that office. All of the trappings, all of the kind of respect and adulation and deference that you get an awesome house and a cool plane, you get a dope helicopter. All those things are hard to leave behind. But I think that, and I hope that, Joe Biden, because Joe Biden, he's a politician that I respect and admire in a lot of ways. The people who know me, they know that my Facebook profile picture was taken one of the 2 times I've met him. And both times he was funny and engaging. For most of his career, he's very clearly been a very, in his own kind of way, a very dynamic and interesting and smart politician, masterful on policy, highly effective in relationship building, yet still somehow had an ordinariness in the best sense of that word. And so, when I see it, and not to be too glib about it, it really does remind me of watching, a favorite athlete get old. Right? So I'm old enough now so that my idols have gone from, these amazing college players to amazing young professionals to old to retired to announcers. And so when you see, I got to Michigan, for example, the year after Tom Brady graduated. And so to give you a sense of my timeline. And so, all of those, to see Brady go through his progression, and then at the end, he didn't have it anymore and he retired. All of the people, Michael Jordan kind of limping around and on one bad knee, like all of those images. It is sad to see it in the moment, but it's also the case that doesn't have to be the lasting image of Joe Biden. And the 4 years that he's had, I still think puts him in the top quartile of presidents ever. He has accomplished more in these 4 years than President Obama accomplished in 8. You could make a legitimate argument that the totality of his political accomplishments in 4 years have been more than the 16 combined years of Clinton and Obama, in terms of both their volume and meaningfulness. But it's also simply the case that he's old. And Father Time is undefeated. Father Time is Willie Mays in a Mets uniform dropping balls. Father Time is Brett Favre throwing interceptions. And Father Time is a politician who does not have what it takes to lead the largest, most dynamic, army in the world's largest economy, a country of 300 million people with diverse interests and backgrounds and all sorts of important issues that going forward we're going to need to figure out and fight about and come to solutions and about. This is a really tricky time. And it's such a lame trope to say it's the most important election of our lifetimes. Who knows? It may be. It certainly presents a stark choice in terms of the different paths that we could go. And this is the moment where Joe Biden has to recognize that the thing that he could do, he has done. And that was a hugely important thing. But now it's time for him to turn the page. And part of that is also the people around him recognizing the importance of the presidency, that the presidency is an office, but it's also a person. And they can't overstate their personal interests in continuing to be part of that office so that they can continue to have a cool job in DC and be important, versus what's best for the country. What's best for the country is for Joseph Biden to immediately say, I promised that I would end Trump's presidency, that I would bring us out of the COVID disaster, that I would make substantive pushes on things like climate and infrastructure, and he's done those things. And he has set the table, which he said he would do in the last election, set the table for the younger generation. Baby boomers have occupied this office since 1993. And I think it's time for us to turn the page on that and move forward. But we can't do it until Joe Biden does the right thing, which is to step down. All right. I don't know if anyone actually made it to the end of this very long. I'm seeing 27 minutes. That's too long. But that's my thoughts on the Biden situation. Hope you liked the video. I'll see you later.